First of all, it's obviously a huge turning point in geopolitics. In a way, it crystallizes what I'd call the new Cold War, in a way somewhat similar to how the Korean War crystallized the militarization of the old Cold War, a dramatic, unexpected, violent event that had a major impact on Western planning. And in one sense, Western diplomats and military planners had a lot of time to think about the implications of tension over Ukraine, but they didn't really come to grips with it until the unexpected extreme act of invasion. So this changes the situation in Europe, certainly, and in other ways more widely with some ramifications for Asia, although I would not exaggerate the change that this implies for the US role in Asia or its relations with allies and with China in Asia. The major issues about Ukraine, it seems to me, are how long the war will last, which I think could be quite a long time, how the danger of escalation will be controlled, and at what point the conditions can emerge for some sort of compromise solution, because it doesn't seem to me that a complete victory by either side is very feasible without the danger of a major war. And I don't think we are yet close to the point where either side is willing to make enough concessions for a compromise solution to be possible. We are seeing the test of a lot of military and economic theories of coercion in the Ukraine war. It's another test for economic sanctions. The economic sanctions the West is imposing on Russia are more extreme than we have used in the past. And it's too early to tell what the ultimate effect will be. Certainly, it will hurt Russia's economy and Russia's war effort. And it may possibly have major military impact if the sanctions help to cripple Russian military production in certain ways. There are reports, for example, that they have had to suspend tank production because of a lack of access to some needed parts. But the sanctions also cut two ways, because they impose pain on the West as well as on Russia. And not just the West, but indirectly the whole world, because of the agricultural implications, the energy supply implications. And in a globalized world, these are felt everywhere. And I'm not an economist, but I suspect even the economists don't know yet how this will all play out. Militarily, it's also too soon to know how things will play out. The big surprise was that Russian forces did so badly and Ukrainian forces did so well in combat. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that that you might call it a pleasant surprise for Ukraine and the West. I think it would be premature to assume that this is going to last indefinitely. I would not write off the possibility that the Russians slowly will recover and make the effort to gradually grind the Ukrainians down. On the other hand, we don't know yet. There are just too many uncertainties about how the differences in military training and morale and logistics will play out over time. So I don't mean to be unhelpful by not predicting what's going to happen, but I do think it's too soon. We do see some interesting examples of the impact of new technologies. For example, the use of drones, which are very cheap and allow quick reaction to intelligence on the battlefield, and have probably enabled tactical innovations of a sort that we haven't seen as dramatically before. Apparently, the effectiveness of anti-tank weapons has turned out to be very great, as well as anti-aircraft missiles. But again, these are tactical changes. How they will all have strategic ramifications is something yet to be seen. So I think the main challenge is finding conditions where both sides can negotiate seriously about a settlement, and I don't think we're close to that yet. And that will all be affected by whether the military trends on the battlefield hold up or go in one direction or the other. So it's still early in the war. It's been a few months yet, but still early. And I don't mean to draw too many parallels to the Korean experience, but as in the Korean War, it would not be a surprise if this dragged on for several years, with neither side making dramatic advances after the lines that have been drawn about now. This is certainly becoming a much more pressing issue now because it's no longer quite as theoretical as it has been for most of the post-Cold War period, not only because of Putin's statements, which could be just diplomatic posturing, but because of the danger that the situation could get out of control and the restraints on caution could be damaged. And in both the cases of Russia and North Korea, we also see the potential danger of a personalistic dictatorship that feels threatened, making decisions that cool, rational, detached analysts would not think make sense. Now, in Europe, in Ukraine, the real risk, it seems to me, is what a situation in which it looks like Russia is being defeated and humiliated. And Putin seems to be facing a choice between a complete embarrassment and disgrace on one hand, or taking the risk of shocking the West into backing off on the other, which could motivate him to think that a symbolic use of nuclear weapons would have that dramatic effect on pushing the West back and getting the West to back down. And that's the scenario that many people are worried about now. And this is a big problem because at present, the sentiment in the West and in Ukraine is to press as much as possible for a Ukrainian victory. If, and of course, it depends on exactly what people think a victory means, but if it means pushing Russia back at least to the lines before the invasion, which would not be a complete victory because it's easy to forget now that Russia had already occupied parts of eastern Ukraine for years before the invasion. But in any case, if it looks like a dramatic victory for Ukraine, then Putin will face this question. So there's a tension between our hopes for punishing the Russians for their aggression on one hand, and the danger of provoking a panicky reaction on the other. Uh, in North Korea, it seems to me uh, the potential danger could be a little different in the sense that while I am not an expert, of course, on Kim Jong-un's psychology, and I don't know if anyone is, even in Korea, but uh, what one might worry about is a strategy in a future crisis where he feels that his nuclear capabilities give him something of a shield against retaliation from the West in a conventional war, where he might feel that he could take conventional military action against South Korea, but not fear a counter invasion of North Korea, as, for example, happened over 70 years ago in the fall of 1950, might think that he would not have to worry about that because his nuclear weapons would deter that. So in a way that would be similar to the apparent thinking of Pakistani strategists in their Kargil war with India over 20 years ago. So that has some similarities to the idea that nuclear weapons can provide a deterrent or coercive leverage against South Korea and the West, but in a somewhat different way in a future crisis. None of this is predictable, of course, and the fact that both Putin and Kim Jong-un seem to have extreme ambitions and few restraints on their power within their own governments is the most worrisome thing about both cases. It's a little hard to say because China is in an awkward position now. It has the same incentives that had been growing for a closer alliance relationship with Russia, because the West was putting pressure on both of them. But China also now sees the risks of too close an alignment with Russia because of the unity of much of the rest of the world in opposition to the invasion of Ukraine. So China's in an awkward position now. And whether they will choose to do as much as they can to help Russia economically without doing so militarily, which would be probably the way to straddle the conflicting demands of supporting Russia and not alienating other countries, or will decide to do as much as it can to help Russia militarily as well, perhaps in secretive ways or in ways that aren't as dramatic as just supplying lots of weapons. That, I think, is still an open question. I think the short-term effect of the Ukraine war is to restrain China in Asia, to restrain Chinese demands, Chinese pressure on other countries, Chinese assertion of its territorial rights. But I suspect that's probably temporary. The big question at the moment is what lessons China will draw from this about the Taiwan issue and what it can get away with on Taiwan. In one sense, China can see the tremendous negative reaction of much of the world, or at least the richer countries in the world, against the invasion of Ukraine. On the other hand, China can recognize that the political and diplomatic status of Taiwan is nowhere near as favorable as Ukraine's was. So whether Chinese restraint about Taiwan, which is probably the effect in the short term, carries over to a longer term, I think is is less certain. But on balance, probably the news is good for Taiwan. Uh, on the other hand, the long-term trend of recent events, it seems to me, still pushes in the direction of encouraging the Chinese-Russian alliance. Because as long as the United States does not want to take major initiatives to accommodate China in Asia, and by that I mean reducing its support for Taiwan, reducing its objections to Chinese claims in the South China Sea, as long as the United States is not willing to do that and persists in promoting human rights and opposing the legitimacy, in a sense, of China's authoritarian regime, it has natural incentives to cooperate with Russia, since both countries are facing the same sort of demands from the West. And that, it seems to me, is not going to be changed by the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war complicates at least the near-term tactics and emphasis in Chinese policy, but I don't think it really changes the long-term incentives.